Hello, this is my presentation called What is a Knowledge Manager and Why Do You Need One? My name is Rory Huston. I'm the Head of Knowledge Management at Cundall Engineers Limited, and this is a presentation that I delivered at Digital Construction Week on the 24th of November 2021. So just a quick bit about Cundall. We are a multidisciplinary engineering consultancy with 21 offices globally and about 950 people worldwide. We're proud to be a One Planet company, and we were the first consultancy to be certified as carbon neutral with the Carbon Trust. We have been recently winning quite a few awards for our work, including Consultancy of the Year at the Construction News Awards and the Education Estates Awards. And if you look really carefully in the bottom corner, you'll see me proudly clutching the CIBSE Building Performance of the Year Awards in 2019. I have been in the construction industry for 20 years and I'm the Head of Knowledge Management at Cundall. I'm a certified knowledge manager with the Knowledge Management Institute, a chartered knowledge manager with CILIP and the Knowledge and Information Management Group at CILIP's KM Vice Chair. I have a keen interest in organisational improvement and collaboration, sustainable transformation, and my kayak is making strange noises and cheese. You like cheese, you might say. And the reason I shared that bit of information is just as an example. There's lots of studies that demonstrate that people who share a bit about themselves and bring their, be a bit more human in their interactions with people starts to help engender trust. And knowledge management is one of these topics that where you start sharing your knowledge and what you know and interacting with other people, that also starts improving trust. Companies that have high levels of trust are reported to be, much more productive, more stress-free. People have fewer sick days and better staff engagement than those with low trust. So, trust and sharing a bit about yourself and good knowledge practices are all important as to helping to oil the wheels at your company to make it more effective. I'm going to divide this talk into three key sections, really. What is knowledge? What is knowledge management, and what does a knowledge manager do? And a few words on return on investment. So what is knowledge? This can be a deep question studied by the likes of Aristotle and Plato. Basically, knowledge managers tend to talk about things being tacit or explicit. And what that means is whether something's very codified and context free and almost approaching fact versus something that's highly contextual and potentially conversational or in somebody's head and less defined. We tend to find that most information that we have in our heads is probably in the tacit domain. It's things that are hard to get hold of and describe and will often be quite context specific. The explicit codified stuff is often written down in standards and guides and things like that. And both sources are really important to use. You'll generally find that it's easier to write down explicit information, and the tacit information is harder to write down. But finding that balance and understanding what it is you're handling is quite important. Another way to think about knowledge is how diffuse or concentrated it is. So if you're looking at thinking about a particular piece of knowledge, is this something that everybody knows and is easy to access? So for example, how to use Microsoft PowerPoint is something that is a very common skill versus a concentrated or specialist skill like how to build a Death Star, just because this happens to look a bit like a Death Star to me. So that's sort of making sure you understand whether this is a concentrated piece of knowledge that might give you competitive advantage is quite important. Another way of thinking about knowledge is trying to understand both your perception and the organisation you're working with's perception of the knowledge. There was a quote by a chap called Donald Rumsfeld a long time ago that there are known knowns, there are also known unknowns, but there are also unknown knowns and unknown unknowns. And what this means is there are things that we're confident that we know. So I know that I can talk to you about knowledge management certification. I know that I don't know very much about how to design a heat pump, but I know that designing and optimizing a heat pump is something that's important if you're operating a building, and I know some people I can talk to explain that process to me. There are things that I probably don't know that I know. So in the back of my head, I could probably tell you what the weather was like yesterday, but I'd have to sort of think about it and try and remember. And that's stuff that sort of comes out often when when you're questioning people or asking someone to try and explain something. And the unknown unknowns is things that you don't know. These are your blind spots, and this is where things can be a little bit tricky. So part of knowledge management is often trying to make sure that we move things from the unknown column on the right hand side into the known column, so we can grapple with it and manage that knowledge. Another way to think about knowledge, and it's sort of related to the is it diffuse or is it concentrated, is whether the knowledge we're talking about resides in an individual, in a community, in an organization, or across the whole of industry. And what we obviously want to do is get the frontier of all of our knowledge, the best practice that everybody knows in a company, and push this to make it as diffuse as possible through the organization so everybody can access it when they need it. So good knowledge management processes will take the knowledge of the individual, be that your expert or your new starter, and diffuse it. So new starters, we want to bring people up to getting access, be able to access as much knowledge as they possibly can as quickly as possible. And if you're an expert, we want to make sure that as many people know your understand your expertise as possible, so that we retain and maintain that competitive advantage. You might also not know that knowledge management also has a ISO standard, which came out a couple of years ago. It's called ISO 30401. It's a bit of a beast. It's similar to the sort of 9000 framework systems. And this has got some really good definitions of what knowledge management and knowledge is. And it says the aim of work is to produce valuable results. Valuable results are derived from applied knowledge, and organizational knowledge is becoming a key differentiator for effectiveness and increased collaboration and competition. So what this says to us is, if we can manage our knowledge effectively, if we can understand what is important knowledge for us to have as a company, and we can improve our staff's access to that, then we're going to be able to perform better. So that's why knowledge management can be quite important to how a company performs. So what is knowledge management? This is Chris Collison, who's one of the rock stars of the knowledge management world. And yes, we do have rock stars. And this is quite a nice definition that he's put together, which is knowledge management is about connecting those who know the recipe more than it is about capturing an encyclopedia of knowledge. Knowledge itself can be held in people's heads and it can be written down, and both sources should be used. It's about striking the right balance of people, process, and technology. And that is, quite critical. Is there are quite a few different parts to knowledge management. It's about the flow and how do we connect people. And as just an aside, data management, information management, and knowledge management are not the same thing. Each are looking at different aspects of this cycle. Data is primarily, numerical facts. Information is more sort of descriptions about things, and knowledge management is more aligned to how do you use those different information sources in the context to get outcomes. Data and information management will be looking at things like integrity of data and completeness of data and systems, document retention, life cycles, all of that kind of stuff, whereas knowledge management is more focused on the users. And that's one of the key things about what is knowledge management. So for knowledge to be useful, it must flow. And that means that you shouldn't just concentrate on creating vast libraries of information and knowledge. You should be thinking about how does this information go from where it exists into somebody's head. So in knowledge management, we usually talk about there being a donor and a recipient of the knowledge, and making sure you're getting that flow working really well. An example is lessons learned in this domain. A lessons learned is a knowledge capture tool. So what you do is you talk to somebody or a project team and find out what's worked well and what hasn't worked well, and then you're capturing those stories. That is great, but if you put those stories of what worked well and what didn't work well on a shelf, and those don't get put into your systems and actioned and passed on to the next project team, it's just a lesson identified. You haven't really gone to the point of moving it through to your recipient to make some actionable insights in it. Knowledge flourishes really when there's the right conditions, so making sure that you're thinking about this flow between the donor and the recipient, and also that you've got the right culture for that. So you want to make sure that if somebody does share some knowledge, that's received well, is in an open environment, and that you have leadership who are modeling these behaviors and asking questions, and when somebody does share knowledge, that they're not shot down, and that everybody is interacting in ways that are going to be useful to you. So what does a knowledge manager do? Another great quote from April Allen from Australia. she says, I think of knowledge management as an overarching capability with the knowledge manager as coach and facilitator, nudging teams and individuals towards improving their knowledge and sharing practices. They do that by enabling a more streamlined information flow between tools, but also by creating the conditions for knowledge to flow between people. Those conditions could be informal opportunities to gather, as well as formal structures like peer learning and mentoring. On top of this, a knowledge manager has a load of tactics that can be deployed. So it's about identifying the problem that needs to be solved and then applying the right tactics to solve that problem. And here is something that a chap called Chris at Knowledge Architecture organises a conference called KA Connect put forward, which is commonly known as the Knowledge Management Periodic Table. And it lists lots of different tactics that you can deploy as a knowledge manager to solve particular problems, such as communities of practice, intranets, lessons learned, people finders, best practice and expertise sharing methodologies, programs and change management, internal communications, webinars and show and tells, workshops, etc., etc. And I think, the most popular tool of choice for any knowledge manager is probably going to be around communities of practice. And I've also had a lot of traction with things like, discussion forums and show and tell webinars and those kind of things to really, just get people connected and understand what's happening in the practice and who they can talk to. So there's lots of different things that you can use as a knowledge manager, and how you choose to assemble a few of these really effectively to solve the needs of the business is what's key. So the knowledge manager will take those OEM parts and they'll assemble them into a process that's going to help you improve the flow of knowledge in your organization, both between systems and between people. Is there a system I can buy to achieve knowledge management in my company? Well, the answer really is no, you can't. There is a lot of software out there that is there to facilitate and unlock knowledge management. But really, it's about 20% about the tech, which is to enable, and about 80% about focusing on people. There is a system, though, that you can implement, which is ISO 30401, if you're feeling brave. And this looks at the whole governance lifecycle and steering sort of groups and system improvements that you can deploy. And again, as I said before, it's very similar to something you might see in ISO 9001. It follows that sort of suite of approaches. There's a very useful book called the KM Cookbook that sort of talks around knowledge management and the general sort of framework principles of ISO 30401, which is by Chris Collison, Paul Corney, who's the current president of CILIP, and Patricia Eng, who is a certified KM auditor. And there's this, what they call the KM canvas in here, which is really useful, which is a whole load of questions that the ISO would ask you. So sort of the key features for making a knowledge management program work. So you're looking at things like strategic context, governance, leadership, support, roles, processes, technology, infrastructure, culture, codification, curation, evaluation, and improvement. So there's a lot of cultural elements and behavioral elements in knowledge management that a knowledge manager needs to cover. So just a little bit of ROI, return on investment. Valuable results are derived from applied knowledge. When you think of your workforce is probably, your most valuable asset, and they are going to be applying their knowledge onto problems and, knowledge of how the company works, knowledge of the client to achieve some outcomes. There's a rule called the 70-20-10 rule of learning, which is 10% of learning is learned through training courses, 20% is through working with or observing others, and 70% is learned through experimentation and challenging assignments. So knowledge management is there to help people when they're on those challenging assignments to get to the answer faster and to learn quicker. So if you start to think about your entire workforce and how do you help them learn to become more effective and operate at a grade or two above them, what's the value of that to you? And if you sort of think about a reference of university, a university degree would cost you around 27k for one person over 3 years, and that will get them to a graduate level. So how do you get people to move quickly through the next steps of their career? In Cundall, for example, we've got 1,000 people. If I can make them 1% more efficient each year, then I've, generated 10 people's worth of education. How do you put a value on that? How do you put a value on great performance? So if you found this convincing and you think that you do want to hire a knowledge manager, I suggest you consider reading Hiring Your First Knowledge Manager, which is a blog by Simon Burton of CB Resourcing, which is quite helpful. It covers things like hiring at the appropriate grades and being clear on what you need to do to get that person in. There's a very useful book, as I mentioned earlier, called the KM Cookbook by Paul Corney and Chris Collison and Patricia Eng, that covers the fundamentals of what you might want to do for getting certified. You can ensure that you have a clear brief of what you want for the knowledge manager to improve and hire accordingly. So if you're looking at people issues, it might be a bit different to if you're looking at a sort of data or system approach. Hire based on character, can do, and driven communicators and people who are self-sufficient and resilient is quite important. For example, most knowledge managers will be working in a small team. They'll be working across quite a few different systems. So you need someone who's quite comfortable and confident with, working with lots of different people in different ways. But make sure you do ask about qualifications. Things like CILIP Chartership for knowledge management and KMI Chartership are very good ones to look at. And be serious in the time and sponsorship that you're going to need to spend with your new manager. It's going to be a fun and bumpy journey, but getting knowledge management and knowledge to flow in your organization is very rewarding. So I hope that explains a bit about knowledge managers, knowledge management, and what we do. Please get in touch either with Cundall or with myself, Rory Huston, on LinkedIn. And thank you for listening.